I was muted so people can't hear me.
They don't,
Now you can hear me.
they don't get to vote.
Yeah, they're not gonna vote. They legally can't vote.
That seems good to me.
We're on some grandfather laws type stuff.
I'm sorry, what?
Beautiful. Okay. So everyone at home, I do got to take roll on all of you too because that's what I'm supposed to do. And that's just life. Yes.
I was wondering about tomorrow.
I'm going to try to keep doing the same thing I have been doing.
Okay. Is it going to be the 8:55?
Yeah. Why didn't I do this in alphabetical order? Give me a sec, I'll move everybody in alphabetical order.
So we got music theory together. Your dad is rad. Huh?
My dad is like,
Rad.
oh, I thought you said red. I was like,
Yeah, he's red. Mr. Partridge got that blue snowball.
Okay, so tomorrow we have a BBQ. I meant Thursday. Unless you want to do it tomorrow. You want to do it today?
No.
wow, you're really
Let's do
funny.
You guys can know this. Okay. Tomorrow BBQ. Thursday BBQ. So you come into class, start writing or typing. I'll give you that choice. Remember, if you plan on taking the AP test and written, you must write it. It has to be in pen. Because the AP exam has to be written in pen. Well, just put a nice neat line. Pen's easy to write with though, because you don't have to press that.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true, but I understand the mistake issue, Joy. Because I make a lot of mistakes when I write. I completely understand. Yeah.
And then you said yesterday that people typing it get like an extra week and a half, right?
The way it looks right now, yeah. But we're going to go back and look at it, and then we got to make sure it all sets up and works out. But it looks like it's going to. If there's any big changes, I'll let you know. I'll get David on the test.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
By the way, you got to take it today. Yes. When is the test? The same week with the BBQ. What is it? May 8th or May 7th? May 8th or May 17th. And so if everything works out right, you'll have a choice. If everything works out right. If there's something comes up where I can't do it, I'll let you know as soon as I find out. Next, so don't forget the DB2. You have to turn in an outline. So you have that written for before you come in, and you have your document, and you can write little facts and things on the documents, all that. You can have that in there, but you write the essay cold in there. You have 42 minutes, whatever. Actually, I'll let you start when you walk in. So as soon as you get here, you start writing. And don't forget that opening paragraph. You need context, some background material. And if the question is about like the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles, well, there'd be a lot of context about ending the war and the actual treaty. That's what we call context. That's the stuff going on. And then don't forget, you're going to organize for a 5-paragraph essay. That means 3 body paragraphs, and on average, each of those body paragraphs will have 2 documents. How many quotes can you have? Well, I'll let you one time use a 5-word quote. Other than that, it's got to be your words. Anybody can copy. You got to prove you understand it by paraphrasing it and showing how the material from the document can be used to connect, to relate to your thesis. Yes, sir.
We have to have.
Yeah, and then on a regular essay, you have to do it for at least 3, but for this one, 2. Remember, half is you must explain why that document had that point of view, or following the template blank, like Wilson believed in the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles because he believed in liberal foreign policy. book by liberal foreign policy and sec, but it was also in that manner. For two of them, that's just one basic sentence of additional materials. Don't forget, there's a bunch of outside information too that you can put in, so relate documents to what you know outside, factual information, cite your documents, have a lot of fun. If you have any questions, please ask. I'm going to give you a lot of material that help you immensely with your exam right now. And no matter which one you do, choose the AP exam, they want a DBQ. And that's, in a way, the documents are great. They help you, they point you to things, they remind you of things. I know it's more work. You have to weigh the good and the bad. But the bad part is on the AP exam, you get no choice. You get one DBQ. And whatever you get, you have to write. And last year, they gave 4 DBQs. 2 were like just perfect. Just everything flowed. 1 was pretty, and 1 was everyone hated. So we all get the ones that we all like, right? That's the fun of standardized tests, isn't it? All right. So let's go ahead then and finish up the. Have you noticed how off-centered the eyes are too? Like this?
It looks like he's halfway through a wink.
It is kind of, doesn't it? Just starting that wink. Where did the Kaiser go, by the way?
Chopping wood.
Chopping wood in? Yeah, the Netherlands. And what were those specially trained soldiers in that last spring offense? Stormtroopers. And the Germans did it before American troops arrived, but also who's out of the war so they can send more troops? Russia. And so that's why they weren't invited to the Treaty of Versailles. And to mention the Argonne American forces, who was the guy with the back tattoo? The overall commander. Foch. Yeah, I know. And by the way, he's going to be after the Treaty of Versailles saying, this isn't going to work. Germany's going to be back in about 20 years. Wow, is he going to be right? So with that, we've had the end of the war. We got here. Did we get to, I showed you the rail car, lots generation, right? So did we get to, how far did we get in this?
A couple more.
We got Lloyd George. Did we get to Wilson?
Yeah.
So we got right to here, 14 points and no GOP?
Yep.
And that is a big deal. They're going to be so angry about that. And part of it is, it was stupid on Wilson's part, but also remember what I told you. If somebody goes sliding, that builds and corrodes and they get angry. And all of us have not slided. All of us have been mad about it. You probably slided somebody, maybe not even realizing it. Then they're mad at you and you don't know why. Which, by the way, is a fun thing. So, what about the other countries? It was going to be a big 4, but Italy was promptly ignored. They had all these secret agreements with Italy and then told, you're not going to get what we promised. Japan, you're not going to be able to scoop up as much land as you thought. And so Italy felt left out. In fact, Italy was humiliated. Victoria, the prime minister, went back to Rome and said, I'm not going. And then he kind of went back. His government collapsed, and we could see the stepping stones to a right-wing reaction. Italy was mistreated, slighted, the veterans mistreated. What's coming? Benito Mussolini, yes. Japan will feel slighted, and this will start triggering more and more militarism. Like, we're never going to get a fair shake. We have to do it ourselves. This is triggering the 30s in China and World War II in the Pacific. And Russia was not invited. Now, yeah, they're in the middle of a civil war, but still, they're not invited. A terrible mistake looking back at it. We recorded, everything good, everyone happy, all right. What is in here? Just one sec. Okay, so with that, here's Wilson when he got there. Thousands came out. By the way, after the Germans signed the treaty, he had to sneak out in the middle of the night. They came in with high aspirations, but very quickly became into basically knife cutting on a map. Who wants what land? Who's going to get what? What do I get out of this treaty? And even though France was correct in making sure Germany should never do it again, how they wanted to do it, combined with they want stuff too. and they would soon ignore other places. The high-minded idea of self-determination devolved into stories about them. They're in this big hotel in Paris, and there's a billiards table. So imagine it like a big pool table, but about twice as big. So this massive table with a blank map of Europe, and they had colored pencils. And the three of them were on this village there with their hands and knees drawing borders of countries. That should give you an idea how arrogant they were when it came to this self-determination. Now we'll give you, this could be the Polish land, we'll split this in half. Basically what's going to happen is they'll fight it. That's what's going to happen after the war. But Germany's the key issue. So what about Germany? Oh, there's the big three at the House of Mirrors in where they signed it in Versailles, the Louis XIV's Great Palace. And if you go there, they have this big, long, mirrored hallway. It's pretty. Versailles, to say it's spectacular is it's not strong enough of a word. But the House of Mirrors, there's all kinds of graffiti because people watching the signing carved into the glass. So all along there are various names and pictures of cannon. It's very weird. But Germany. So what of Germany? Well, Germany would send representatives of their new provisional government. Many of them were opposed to the war. But to the Allies, they didn't care. Not only did they ignore them, they locked them in a hotel room and said, you're going to sign whatever treaty we put in front of you. And to make sure they do it, they kept the blockade going, starvation blockade, for 6 months after the war ended. Okay, a little bit of more food got in during the war, but still, thousands would die or forever be different because they kept this starvation blockade going on. Let's be clear about it. They never forgot this. You can see elements of what's coming over and over. Yes?
I was just asking, so is the Allies blockading Germany?
Yeah, Allies blockading Germany. And Austria and Turkey and Bulgaria, but Germany was. So they kept this going on. And the Germans were thinking, it's going to be 14 points in a war, or victory, or I'm sorry, peace without victory, and a better world. No. In fact, they did not want to sign it, but they had no choice. And what's going to come out of it is a number of things. First off, an earthquake. Secondly, the war guilt clause. The war guilt clause said that Germany had to take full responsibility for the war. Full responsibility for the war. Now, Germany deserves most of the responsibility, but it's much more complex than saying that. You think about the foolishness of Austria or Russia. And heck, Britain entered on by choice, and so did the United States. But Germany had to take full responsibility. By taking full responsibility, then they can be punished. The treaty can be punitive. The big problem for this is, even though Germany probably deserves the most responsibility, von Moltke, militarism, this will infuriate Germans after the war. We were forced to do this. A lot of them didn't think they really lost, and then you add that to it, it makes it worse. Combined with, they lost all their colonies. All their colonies in Africa and the Pacific. Colonies, remember we talked about imperialism, so much of their prestige. Next, lost territory. Germany lost big hunks of Europe. Okay, they lost Alsace and Lorraine, the lost provinces back to France, little bits of Belgium, but the biggies here. They lost massive parts of Silesia and Prussia. Right here, I'm just telling you the German state names, to Poland. In fact, Germany is now going to be divided up into two. Germany proper and then East Prussia. And there'll be a finger of Poland, so they had access to the sea, called the Polish corridor. And the vast majority of people who lived here were ethnic Germans, yet they're now in Poland. That won't be a cause for any conflict down the road. I don't see anything coming here in 1939, September. We'll come back to the Polish corridor. And then they had to limit their military dramatically. And you can certainly understand why the French wanted this. But so much of the German prestige was based on their military. And the military is going to take a massive hit. Remember when the war began, they had 4.5 million men? Now, only 100,000 men. No Air Force, no submarines, no capital ships. Those are the big dreadnought battleships. No tanks. Now, they didn't really have any tanks, but they took them away. to Germany. Now they are undefended, especially with a threatening new country called the Soviet Union right there. They feel very threatened from the east, and a very aggressive Poland. Poland was very aggressive, powerful. Yeah, they blow it all in the 1930s, but they were very powerful in the 20s. And so, Germany felt totally denuded. And I should add one thing. After the war, you have all these armed men coming home. Most of them kept their weapons. They formed these militias. Some were kind of left-wing, almost pro-communist. Some were ultra-right-wing. Gee, I wonder ultra-right-wing militias. We're coming to something called the Brown Shirts. You might have heard of them. And then they had to pay a punishment. A punitive punishment called reparations. $33 billion would eventually be settled upon. They didn't settle it in the treaty. They just said we'll have a commission. Originally, it was going to be $55 billion. They reduced it to $33 billion. And most of it was to pay back, like France and Belgium, for the destruction they did. So they had to give money, like yearly payments to France, a little bit to Britain and other places, but also things like 1,000 milk cows to Belgium. 100 camels to this brand new country called Saudi Arabia. Things like that. The whole goal was not just as punishment, though. In Athens, they wanted to hurt their economy. They wanted this drain on the German economy so they wouldn't militarize again. There's a logic to it. But as economists who were there, this brand new field called economics realized this won't be big enough to drain their economy so they can't militarize, but it would be big enough to cause pain. And who would they blame for that pain? The Allies. In fact, that economist will be a guy we'll get to in the 1930s. His name is John Maynard Keynes. We'll get to him. Probably the most influential economist of the last 100 years. He's like, this is too much. This is going to make Germany angry. There's elements that weren't bad, but it's built in such a way that Germany will blame the Allies for this horrible treaty. And that happened almost immediately. Oh, here's a great cartoon. Here's when they originally thought it'd be 55 billion, crushing Germany. And then Germany's like, let's see you try to collect it. What are you going to do? Yeah.
Didn't they recently pay off the reparations? Like 2014 or something like that?
Yeah, they finally paid off the whole reparations, yeah. And that includes, so after World War II, when Germany was divided up in East and West Germany continued very minor payments. But the thing is, because there's been so much inflation, okay, to us, I know 55 billion or 33 billion is just pocket change. No, but as years go, that gets smaller and smaller because the dollar, euro, then it was Deutschmarks, whatever it is, will be worthless. And so here's a good two really good cartoons from Germany showing their attitude in 1919. First off, what a cartoon, the starvation blockade. Isn't that a very effective cartoon? And everyone in Germany, when they saw this, they knew exactly what this referred to. But second, here's Germany led to the gallows by Wilson, Clemenceau, and Lord George. And they wanted the guillotine. The French were still using it. In fact, the last person guillotined was 1974. Nazi Germany really liked the guillotine too. But it also had the reference to the French Revolution and the terror. Some of you know about that. So Germany is going to want revenge for the treaty. And you're going to see ultra-right-wing parties will latch on to this. We could have won this war, but we didn't. And then they put these chains of the Treaty of Versailles, which is an effective one, showing it as a big snake. And by the way, these militia, they want to have the German symbol for their military was a Maltese cross. But since they're militia, they use other types of crosses for these militias after the war. Could be any kind of cross. I don't know, I could think of some cross to appeal to these militia. Have you seen this one before? Had no real meaning. They just chose it because it looked like there was a cross and some militia units. So, or there's a British cartoon. I love Versailles and what comes out of it. I just love how they call it the Hitler Party. But that's a British cartoon. And then, what are the problems with self-determination? If you got a bunch of guys who really, especially Lloyd George and Wilson, know nothing about Central Europe, and Clemenceau only knew slightly more, and they're drawing borders, what came out is this hodgepodge of nations that were also multi-ethnic and multinational, multi-language and multi-religion. And so they would have to fight it out again. And there would still be fighting as late as 1923, 1924 over these borders. And a lot of the roots of World War II would stem from these borders. Hungary's still mad about the Treaty of Versailles to this day. And Yugoslavia is going to be made another one of these hodgepodge of different Slavic ethnic groups. In the 1990s, there'll be a horrific civil war. Unbelievably violent and bloody. And see the corridor? Not only that, what are the colonies? Now there's talk of self-determination. Oh, but not for the colonies. And yes, there is a huge racial element there. But they decided to divvy up the former colonies of all the Central Powers. They called them mandates. But what were the mandates? Just colonies. So Britain just took over Southwest Africa and Tanganyika, German colonies, and they became British mandates, which meant colonies. Same thing like Cameroon was split between France and Britain. In the Ottoman Empire, the United States, there was talk of giving them an Armenian mandate after what happened with the genocide. That never happened. The genocide did not end until 1923. It was not quite as violent as 1916, 1917, but, for example, this big area of the Ottoman Empire, they created these countries, French mandates of Lebanon and Syria, out of former Ottoman provinces. Boy, were they furious about the French colony. There'd be no problem with that down the road. The British would make a country out of 3 Ottoman provinces because they wanted to control the oil, called Iraq. And that would be a British mandate. Once again, nothing to see here, move on. They made up this area here, they called it the Transjordan, now it's Jordan. And then they just kind of carved out a piece here and called it Palestine. Once again, nothing to see here, move on. Oh, and eventually this independent area here would become Saudi Arabia. And they didn't take up the mandate, they figured, why do we want that? Ibn Saud, the first leader of Saudi Arabia, could carry the entire treasury of Saudi Arabia in a little box around his neck. Things changed in Saudi Arabia. Moving on. And so that gets us to the arguments about the treaty. That gets us to the argument. And we got to come up with different types of foreign policy. Foreign policy. And here's Woodrow Wilson's, his League of Nations, and here's Republican hostiles. Even there's some Democratic hostile too. But there are 2 different points of view towards foreign policy. Now, this is going to be a relatively simplistic definition, but we can see elements of this in a lot of different ways, and we break it down into liberal and conservative foreign policy. And once again, we have to get away from, this is my team, this is your team, and give you elements of what is liberal, elements of what is conservative, and we can see people having both, and there are people who can have liberal economic ideas and conservative foreign policy. Because these terms are misused so much, everybody seems to want to have a label of what they are. Please don't get bogged down in that. So give you some liberal and conservative foreign policy ideas. And we'll see elements of both. So first off, the liberal idea is this is a very complex, nuanced world. Where the more conservative idea is, yeah, there's complex, but we don't care about that. There's good versus evil. So it's very bipolar. We got polar opposites. It's very Yankee. So it's either good or evil. And good, let's be clear about it. Don't think in terms of what is actually moral or virtuous. We can make that argument later. Good, what we want to do. Evil, what somebody else wants to do. Here, it's much more complex and nuanced. By the way, can't you see advantages in both? Because this is complex, therefore it's complex. And complex is complex. You get the point? Yeah, we understand that. It's easier. It's easier to understand. It's easier to argue for. It's easier to make this is what we want, this is what we want. Oops, wow, did we go? Liberal, more internationalist. So they want foreign affairs. But I put a question mark because this can still be a gray area too. Conservative is more isolationist. So we don't want to get involved in too many international, let's say, treaties or organizations. But you will see people who are very liberal down the road be called isolationists because they didn't want to go to war or didn't want to get involved in the arms race after the Cold War. Yet they're very internationalists. And so that's why I put question mark. It's still, these terms can be used for different things. And you get people that are very, in a lot of ways, conservative in some ways, but called internationalists because they want to get the U.S. involved in military alliances after World War II. And so I'm just putting question marks there because it's a little more complex. Next. So the more liberal idea is more diplomacy. To avoid war through, sometimes you got to talk to your enemy. And you have to show empathy. Empathy means understanding their point of view. It doesn't mean you agree, but understanding. Or a more conservative point of view is more and more unilateral. And don't forget what I told you. There are different degrees of this. You see elements. And unilateral could be, if we're going to go to war, we'll go at it alone. And the war that was going on when you were born was very much a unilateral program by the United States. Britain joined along, they thought they could get some loot out of it, and that's by definition pretty conservative too. But in Iraq. Next. The liberal idea then after the war is, you're going to see this idea is we want to make sure that we don't have future wars. So let's say in Germany, we should help them rebuild. So they'll have no excuse to go to war. By the way, consequences of your actions today in foreign policy, unintended consequences, bad consequences are called blowback. It's blowback. So you do something today in foreign policy, if it comes back to bite you, it's blowback. So for example, punishing Germany will have pretty big blowback, wouldn't it? That's what the definition of blowback. A really good one today that affects us right now, that does too, is in 1953, the United States and Britain overthrew a democratically elected government in Iran. Homegrown democracy. That's a very liberal democracy. Now replaced with a horrific dictatorship that tortured their people to suppress free speech. Awful. The Shah of Iran, their model. And then when they were overthrown, who replaced it? Very radical, Shia, Muslim, revolutionaries. They're still in power today. And who do they blame for all their problems? The country that overthrew them back in 1953, to this day. And we're talking about Iran. That's unbelievable blowback. And so with that, conservative, a little more punitive. You've got to punish. By the way, can't you see elements of the Treaty of Versailles with Germany about some liberal things and some conservative things? I mean, people have different points of view, and you can see why some people are more liberal be upset and more conservative upset. After World War II, the U.S. would help Germany and Japan rebuild. And without a doubt, that avoided blowback down the road. And so that's the basic element of liberal and conservative. So with that, let's get to another element of the League of Nations. Because this is where it's going to blow up in the non-ratification. Article 10 of the Treaty of Versailles was partially setting up the League of Nations, but in Article 10, it laid out the concept of collective security. Actually, it's Article 10 and 11, but Article 10 was the one that people in the U.S. went nuts. So don't forget, this is part of the Treaty of Versailles. It's part of it. But the Treaty of Versailles set up the League. And what it said is all League members will collectively guarantee the security of other League members. So we will all together, the biggest or the smallest, we will all declare that we will defend them. Now let's be clear about this. There were less than 40 countries in the world at that time. We have over 200 countries in the world now. So it was a little bit different world, but still. And the idea would be is the members would be unified to stop aggression. So if one country, let's say Austria, attacked Serbia, and Serbia was a member of the League of Nations, all the other countries in the world would vow to defend Serbia. Now, if you look at this on the surface, it might look like, what? Are we going to be at war all the time? No. Okay, let me rephrase that. No, that was not the plan. The plan was it would deter aggression. Who would be crazy enough to attack if all the rest of the world were unified? So we will deter aggression and we won't have it anymore. And the idea is, therefore, we have no choice but to come up with diplomatic agreements, reduce arms, etc. That's Article 10. And this is the area that people who are more conservative foreign policy-wise went nuts. Why? First off, it seemed to violate the Constitution. The Constitution says Congress declares war. Doesn't this imply that the League of Nations is going to send us to war? No, actually it didn't say that. It's more complex than that. The League of Nations could not compel people to go to war, but it appeared like it. By the way, what's ironic about this? When's the last time Congress has declared war? 1942, during World War II. And we've been at war your entire life. And so the idea that Congress is worried about the Constitution, that's really ironic because the Congress has basically said today, we're not going to do our constitutional duty, we'll let the president go to war when the president wants. Now you can say that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's generally bad. I'll tell you my bias. I usually don't trust one person. There's only one person I trust. Right? And what's the only one person you trust? Because that's what you say in this classroom because you know I'm grading you. As soon as you leave, you say that. Okay. And the other thing is, it's like to be forced into constant war. And the thing about it is, and they said this, why do we care if Hungary and Romania go to war? Why should Americans shed blood for that? We don't care. It's our country. Let them do what they want. And there is an element of truth. How many people in here want to go fight and die if, let's say, Germany attacks Czechoslovakia? Yeah, that's my precursor to World War II. That's a World War II reference. Would you be willing to die for that? Josh was making comments back there, so he must be ready to die for that. Because he's a loon. No. So with that. So the ratification battle then will be about liberal and conservative arguments, a little bit about Germany, not so much about the other areas, that's what we focus on Versailles, but that Article 10. And remember, you need 2/3 of the Senate, and the Republicans have a majority, and Wilson's a Democrat. They don't like Wilson. Wilson's really arrogant anyways. And Wilson's going to come back, and he basically does not want the treaty to be changed at all. Treaties can be changed a little bit. Everybody acknowledges that to make sure that Britain and France understood 2/3 is a lot. That's really hard to get. By the way, you notice the font changed for the 2/3 when I make the fractions. Didn't like my Germania font. So we have three basic groups. The loyal Democrats or the Wilson supporters, and these L's, loyal Democrats, they basically were supporting the treaty as is. Article 10, keep with issue for Germany. There are other issues, but we're just focusing on these. Like Japan wanted big hunks of China. Next, reservationists. These are mostly Republicans, and they had liberal elements, but they hated Article 10. They wanted massive changes to Article 10. And their leader, Henry Cabot Lodge. That's a cartoon of Lodge escorting a treaty with reservations. Lodge hated Wilson. And then lastly, the Irreconcilables. Irreconcilables were a couple of Democrats, mostly Republicans, and they don't want the treaty at all. And they are mostly conservative. There were a couple that were upset at the punitive treatment of Germany, but they also didn't want Article 10. And they weren't going to vote for the treaty any way possible. Now, this made up about 25% of the vote. So they could get the treaty passed. The problem is, reservationists and loyal Democrats to Wilson have got to come together. Who's got to compromise? I mean, Lodge could give in, but if Wilson makes a few changes to Article 10, the treaty would have ratified. Instead, what does Wilson do? He decides to take it to the senators, the reservationist senator states. Wilson began a campaign where he gave speeches, but he was not quite the same after the flu. He gave these speeches to rail against reservationists, telling voters, you have to persuade your senators to vote for the treaty and no reservations. Which, by the way, that usually doesn't work very well. If somebody comes from out of state and tells you what to think, a lot of people get very insular. How dare you tell me? I may not like my senator, but he's my senator. And we see that in the States, a little bit in Montana, really see it in the South. Really see it there. It's very insular action. Yeah.
Also, doesn't that assume that senators actually vote based on the constituents?
That's actually a valid point. Senators don't, or members of, they figure probably correctly that people aren't paying attention.
Yeah. It's to keep that doesn't matter.
And they can use other issues to get people to vote.
Yeah.
You know, find someone to hate. Yeah. And then he had a stroke in Colorado. And this stroke was a horrible stroke. It was almost certainly triggered by the flu, and it was followed by 2 more strokes. And they didn't realize for a very long time, and the treatment was relatively limited then. And he would be incapacitated for 6 months. There was no constitutional remedy for what to do if the president can't carry out their powers. Nobody knew what to do. And the Constitution had not been amended. Now there's been the 25th Amendment. They didn't know about that. That wasn't around then. So Wilson's new wife, Wilson had recently married, he was a widow. His wife kept it secret. And she basically made sure whoever came in to see him and who didn't, as he was starting to slowly recover, but he never fully did. So at the time they needed Wilson, or at least the confidence that Wilson was making decisions for these people here, nobody knew for sure. And so that pretty much ended negotiation right there. It's one of those what ifs. My guess is Wilson was so convinced of his moral correctness that he wouldn't have changed. And so there would be 3 votes. 3 votes. The first vote would have reservations. The first vote, reservations. A few limits to Article 10. But loyal Democrats and irreconcilables voted against it. So it did not get the 2/3 necessary. The second one was what Wilson wanted. No change to the treaty, didn't pass. Irreconcilables and reservationists voted against it. And by the way, you have to have something in your essay about the vote. Because the question is very clear about ratification. And if you write about things about the ratification but don't actually mention what happened, that's a massive hole in the essay. That's what we call a hint. Catch that? And third, reservations. Wilson was vague, but he never fully, it's called, released his Democrats. Said you can vote your conscience. So most of them stayed with Wilson. It got the majority, but not the 2/3. If Wilson would have allowed for some reservations, it probably would have passed. But instead, the United States never ratified the treaty and never entered the League. Now, the U.S. is going to demobilize and have a tiny little army after the war, but it's by far the most powerful economy in the world after World War I. All the competitors, except for Japan, destroyed themselves. Japan actually came out stronger, too, in a way. So with that, oh, by the way, look at this cartoon. So here it shows the League of Nations, and it's Uncle Sam marrying, and it says foreign intelligence. You see that? And by the way, see the peace proceedings. What were you pointing out?
That's the document.
Yeah, that's a document. It's a good one, too. And here comes the U.S. Senate with constitutional rights. It's one of those breaking up the wedding, stopping it. is that which one of the three groups I've talked about does that represent? The reservationists, the irreconcilables, or the loyal Democrats or supporters of Wilson? Reservationists or irreconcilables. Does that make sense? Because you could argue he's just trying to change it, or you can argue he wants to throw it out. But for whatever it is, we don't want to get involved with foreign entanglements. To be honest, I don't trust either one of those two. But I don't trust him. The only person I trust, right there. So we're not ratified, and the United States would not be involved in the Treaty of Versailles. I love how it has the League of Nations and the biggest economy in the world. No linchpin to the League of Nations. I'm sure this won't cause any problems in the 1930s. So in the events that led to World War II, the United States would not be involved. No, the United States was still involved in trade, they're involved in international agreements, so there was some international elements, but there were also isolation. We had this weird dual thing. Here it is for the U.S. staying out. It's supposed to represent like the United States as a Titanic, and let's avoid the icebergs. On that happy note, so tomorrow my plan is to still do what I have been doing on Wednesdays. Sound good? And then on Thursday, and don't forget, if you have any questions about the DBQ, if you want to take a look at something, drop me a note on chat. Keynes is working again. It wasn't working all day yesterday. Huh? Yeah. Please drop me a note. I'll answer any question. I'll try to give you some hints, some ideas about the DBQ. See, you're back. Is it fun? Weird? Have a good day, everybody. Same deal, and then I'll report it.
Wilson's wife. Dude, in that situation, Wilson really wasn't gonna like her.
That's a thing. I like that. That's a good name. What kind of music? Yeah. It's a one-way street. Even though I go up it. Yeah. You can go up from the top part and you go down there. You're not allowed to go up lower. No. So that's I know. But yeah, he's just doing other things. Oh, social housing. There you go.
I have more energy than yesterday. What about how earlier? I still have energy. And like my focus doesn't have very good. It's just not true. And so like this class I can actually then it goes, it drops off from there. Like all the way down to that.
In the middle, I said good morning. I'm sorry.
This is actually easier. All you have to do is put like girl.
I thought it was more.
You were in it.
You just go through those ones.
That's all I'm going to say. All I'm going to say. Computer,
So they have to have a different, like, we're gonna keep that, right?
shut up.